The officer didn't ask for her ID first. He asked her to put the fuel nozzle down like she was holding a weapon. Every head at the gas station turned. The woman beside pump number 4 looked down at her own hand, then back at the officer like her brain needed a second to catch up with what was happening. She was not yelling, she was not resisting. She hadn't even filled half the tank. And yet this man was already speaking to her loud enough for strangers to hear. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle." The line went quiet. Not normal quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when people sense they are watching someone be singled out in real time, and nobody wants to be the first to say it. The woman slowly let go of the nozzle. 38-year-old Alora Vance stood there in a faded denim jacket, one hand trembling at her side, the other still holding the military fuel authorization card her husband had left behind before deployment. The officer took one look at the card and smiled. Not kindly, like he had finally found what he came for. "A stolen military ration card," he said. "That's serious." Alora blinked, then frowned, because for one strange second she looked less shocked than confused. Almost like she wasn't confused by the accusation, she was confused by him, by how certain he sounded, by how personal it already felt. And then he said the sentence that changed the entire day. "Your husband isn't here to help you now." That was the moment the air changed, because the officer thought he was embarrassing a woman alone at a gas wartime line. What he didn't know was that Alora's husband had prepared for this exact kind of moment before he left. Not the gas station, not the fuel card, him. And locked inside her glove compartment was a sealed packet with one instruction written across the front: "Open only if an officer questions the authorization." What happened after that didn't just stop the humiliation, it triggered a chain reaction that reached the base, reopened buried complaints, and put a spotlight on a man who had gotten far too comfortable targeting military families when their spouses were away. But to understand why Alora never threw the card away, and why her husband prepared for a confrontation he wasn't even there to witness, we need to start with the last conversation they had before he deployed. And trust me, what he said to her that night did not sound like goodbye. The last night before he deployed, he didn't pack first. He locked the front door. Then he carefully checked it again, like a man who didn't trust what was on the other side of it. Alora noticed, but she didn't say anything right away. She stood in the kitchen, arms folded loosely, watching him move through the house with a kind of quiet precision she had never seen before. Not even during his previous deployments. This was different. Not rushed, but intentional. "Didn't you already check that?" she asked finally. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked past the door, glanced once at the window, then turned back toward her. "Yes," he said, "I did." But his voice didn't match the answer, because people who are sure don't double-check like that, and people who are leaving don't usually look like they're trying to memorize where everything is. Alora leaned against the counter. "Elias," she said softly, "you're doing that thing again." He paused. "What thing?" She tilted her head slightly. "The one where you pretend everything's normal when it's not." For a second, something shifted in his face, like he was deciding how much to say. Then he walked over, pulled out one of the kitchen chairs, and sat down. That alone told her everything, because Elias Vance was not the kind of man who sat down when he was about to leave. "Come here," he said. Alora didn't move right away. Something about the tone made her chest tighten. "Elias, just come here," he repeated, softer this time. So she did. She walked around the counter and sat across from him, studying his face the way you do when you're trying to understand a version of someone you've never met before. Up close, the difference was clearer. His eyes, they weren't tired. They were alert, too alert. Like he hadn't been sleeping, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't feel safe enough to. "What's going on?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer the question. Instead, he reached into his jacket and placed something on the table between them, a small plain envelope. Alora frowned. "What is that?" Elias slid it toward her. "Something I need you to keep in the car." She didn't touch it. "Why?" "In the glove compartment," he continued, like she hadn't asked. "Not the house, not your bag, the car." Alora's eyes narrowed slightly. "Elias." Now her voice had changed, less soft, more direct. "What is this?" He leaned back in his chair, exhaled slowly, and for the first time that night, he didn't look like he had control of the conversation. "It's nothing you need to use," he said. That was the wrong answer. Alora let out a short breath through her nose. "That's not what I asked." A thick silence settled between them, the kind of silence that doesn't come from confusion, but from something being held back. "Why do I need it?" she asked again. Elias looked at her, really looked at her this time, and when he spoke, his voice dropped just enough to make the words feel heavier than they should have been. "In case someone tries to make a decision about you without knowing who you're connected to." Alora blinked. "What does that mean?" He didn't respond immediately, and that hesitation, that was when she felt it. It made her sit up straighter without even realizing it. "Elias," she said slowly, "who would be making decisions about me?" "People who think you're alone," Elias replied. The words landed harder than expected. Alora stared at him. "What are you talking about?" Elias leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "This isn't about where I'm going. It's about what happens while I'm gone." Her chest tightened. "That doesn't make sense." "It will," he replied. That didn't help. "Then explain it," she said. But instead of explaining, he pushed the envelope closer to her again. "Just listen carefully," he said. "If anyone ever questions you about anything that has my name attached to it, access, clearance, authorization, you do not argue." Alora frowned. "I wasn't planning to." "You don't explain," he continued. "You don't defend yourself." Her expression shifted. "Elias, you're not making any sense. You open that envelope." He said it firmly this time. Alora stopped talking, because now she understood something important. This wasn't a suggestion. This was instruction. She glanced down at the envelope, then back up at him. "What's inside it?" Elias didn't answer right away, and that was the moment everything changed, because for the first time since she had known him, he looked like a man who didn't fully trust the system he worked in. "It's something that makes people slow down," he said finally. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I'm giving you." Frustration flickered across her face. "So I'm just supposed to carry this around and wait for someone to, what, accuse me of something?" Elias didn't smile, didn't soften. "If it happens," he said, "you'll know." That made her sit back, because there it was, not clearly said, but not hidden either. If it happens, not if something might happen. "Elias," she whispered, "what aren't you telling me?" He looked away, just for a second, but she caught it, and that was enough. "Hey," she said, leaning forward slightly, "look at me." He did, and whatever she saw in his eyes in that moment, it erased the last bit of doubt she had. "You think something's going to happen to me?" she asked. "No." The answer came too fast, too clean, like it had been prepared. Alora held his gaze. "Don't do that," she said quietly. "Don't give me the version that sounds better." Elias exhaled, then slowly reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. "I think," he said carefully, "that some people get comfortable when they believe no one is watching them." Alora's fingers tightened slightly under his. "And you think I'll run into one of those people?" Another pause. Then, "You think you might." Alora swallowed. "And this," she said, glancing at the envelope, "this stops them?" Elias nodded once. "It makes them reconsider." "That's not very reassuring." "It's not supposed to be," he replied. She let out a breath, looked down, then back up again. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because I won't be here to say it later." That hit harder than anything else, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The house felt quiet, like it was already adjusting to his absence before he had even left. Alora picked up the envelope slowly, turned it over in her hands. Still no label, no indication of what it contained, just weight. "You really think I'll need this?" she asked. Elias didn't hesitate this time. "Yes." She studied him for another second, then nodded once. "Okay." That was it. No argument, no more questions, just acceptance. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was what he said next. "If you never use it," he added, "that means everything went the way it was supposed to." Alora frowned slightly. "And if I do?" Elias held her gaze. "Then it means someone made a mistake." She let out a quiet breath. Whose mistake? He didn't answer, because he didn't need to. The next morning, he left before sunrise. No long goodbye, no dramatic moment at the door, just a quiet kiss on her forehead and a promise that sounded more like a warning than anything else. "Keep it with you," he said. And then he was gone. 3 days later, Alora stood at pump number 4, holding that same envelope in her glove compartment and listening to a man in uniform tell her to step away from her own car. And as she looked at his face, his confidence, his certainty, the way he spoke like he had already decided who she was, something cold settled in her chest. Because suddenly, Elias's words didn't feel confusing anymore. They felt precise. And the officer standing in front of her, he didn't know it yet, but he had just become the mistake. By the time Officer Grant Holloway reached her pump, the station had already taken on the strange mood that fuel rationing created in people. Nobody ever looked relaxed anymore. Engines idled in long lines that curled around the block. Drivers watched the gauge on the pump as if every number were personal, and the smallest inconvenience could turn a tired face into an angry one in seconds. People had started measuring their days around what they could still get: bread, milk, distance, and fuel, more than anything, made people suspicious. Suspicious of strangers, suspicious of neighbors, suspicious of anyone who seemed to have access they did not. Alora Vance had felt that tension the second she pulled in. She had not come to the station to make a statement or attract attention. She was there for the same reason everyone else was there. She needed enough gas to get through the week, enough to take 8-year-old Micah to school, enough to stop by the pharmacy for her mother, enough to keep life moving while her husband was overseas and every ordinary task felt heavier than it used to. She had been standing at pump 4 for less than 3 minutes when she noticed the officer watching her. At first, it was only a feeling, the kind you try to dismiss because you do not want to seem paranoid. Then she looked up and saw him near the service bay, one hand resting on his belt, his attention fixed on her with a level of interest that felt too deliberate to be casual. He was not scanning the lot. He was not walking patrol. He was watching her. Alora looked away and tried to focus on the slow click of the pump. Maybe he was monitoring everyone using military ration cards. Maybe that was all this was. Maybe the station had been told to expect fraud. Maybe she was tired. Maybe Elias's warning had planted something in her mind and she was seeing danger where there was none. Then the officer began walking toward her and all those maybes disappeared. He did not approach like someone with a quick question. He approached like a man entering a scene he believed already belonged to him. "Ma'am," he said, stopping close enough that she could smell coffee on his breath. "Step away from the pump." His voice was not loud yet, but it was pitched to carry. Alora turned her head and saw, almost immediately, that 2 people in the next lane had gone still. She kept one hand on the nozzle. "Is there a problem?" He looked at the card clipped near the pump, then at the authorization in her hand, and something in his expression settled into place. It was not uncertainty. If anything, he looked almost satisfied. "I said step away from the pump." There was a pause just long enough for everyone nearby to notice that he had repeated himself without answering her. Alora slowly released the handle and stepped back. The nozzle clicked as it stopped pumping. A thin drop of fuel slid down the metal tip and darkened the concrete beneath it. The officer reached past her, removed the card from the slot, and studied it for a second longer than necessary. "Military fuel authorization," he said, reading it like evidence, "registered to a deployed service member." His eyes came back to hers. "You want to tell me how you got this?" The question should have sounded procedural. It did not. It sounded personal. Alora straightened a little. "It belongs to my husband." He gave a small smile, the kind that carried no warmth at all. "Of course it does." That smile got under her skin faster than the accusation itself, because it told her something simple and ugly. He had already decided what she was before she answered him. She had not been approached as a driver. She had been approached as a suspicion. She glanced around the station and saw what public embarrassment always looks like in its early stages. People trying not to stare while staring anyway. Someone pretending to check their phone while listening. A woman in an SUV leaning slightly toward her cracked window. The officer lifted the card between two fingers. "Do you have documentation showing you're authorized to use restricted military fuel access tied to an active deployment?" The wording was formal, but the tone was not. It was the tone of a man who enjoyed making someone else feel smaller with official language. Alora thought of the kitchen table, the envelope between them, Elias telling her not to argue, not to explain, not to defend herself. At the time, she had hated how little he was willing to say. She had thought he was being overcautious, maybe even dramatic. Standing here now with strangers watching and this officer speaking to her like she had been caught in a lie, she understood the difference between paranoia and preparation. "It belongs to my husband," she said evenly. The officer tilted his head. "That's not the same thing as proving it." His eyes dropped briefly toward the car, then back to her face, and for the first time she sensed that this was not random. He was not only checking the card, he was studying her reactions, as if he had done this before and knew the sequence. First the command, then the pressure, then the public doubt. He seemed to know exactly how quickly shame makes people start talking too much. "What's your husband's name?" he asked. "Elias Vance." Something very slight passed across his face. It was gone so quickly she almost wondered if she imagined it, but she did not. The name meant something to him, not enough to stop him, but enough to register. He looked at the card again. "And you left this with you?" "Yes." "For wartime rationing?" "Yes." "And you expected nobody to question that?" The way he said it made her chest tighten, because it was not really a question at all. It was an invitation for the crowd to join him in disbelief. Alora heard herself breathe in. She could feel anger trying to rise, but anger was exactly what this kind of man knew how to use. She had seen people like him before, not often, but enough to recognize the confidence. He wanted resistance because resistance would let him harden. He wanted emotion because emotion would make his behavior look necessary. So instead, she asked, "Officer, what exactly are you accusing me of?" He did not answer immediately. He looked at her with an expression that made it clear he did not like being forced into precision. "I'm saying military resources are often misused," he replied. "I'm saying stolen access cards are not unheard of, and I'm saying a lot of people think they can borrow authority that does not belong to them." Borrow authority. The phrase landed harder than it should have. Not because it was clever, but because it revealed him. In his mind, the issue was not only fuel, it was that she was standing there with access attached to a man who was not present, and he had already decided that made her vulnerable to challenge. The card was not what offended him, it was the absence of the person he thought gave it legitimacy. Then he said, "Your husband isn't here to help you now." There it was.
Not implied, not hidden under procedure. Plain. For 1 second, Alora forgot about the people watching. She forgot about the pump, the line, the smell of gas in the air. All she could hear was that sentence and the ugly little truth tucked inside it. This was never just about verifying authorization. He wanted her to feel alone. And because he wanted that, he had made a mistake. Alora looked at him differently after that. Not with fear, and not even with surprise, with clarity. She thought of Elias standing in the kitchen, exhausted and alert, telling her that some people get comfortable when they believe no one is watching them. At the time, she had not understood that he was not warning her about danger in the dramatic sense. He was warning her about men who had learned how to hide themselves behind policy, tone, timing, and the confidence that comes from choosing their moments carefully. The glove compartment. The envelope. She had almost forgotten it was there because she had not wanted to believe she would need it. Now she knew better.
If there's documentation, the officer said, now would be the time to produce it. His voice had changed. He was quieter now, but not calmer. If anything, he sounded more intent, as if he sensed the moment tightening around them and wanted to force it in his direction before it slipped away. Alora turned toward the driver's side door. The station seemed to hold its breath with her. She opened the car and leaned in. Her fingers found the latch for the glove compartment, and as it dropped open, she saw the envelope exactly where she had left it, tucked flat beneath the registration papers. For a brief second, she hesitated. It was a strange hesitation, not because she doubted Elias, but because she suddenly understood that opening this envelope meant crossing a line she could not uncross. Up to this point, it was still possible to imagine the scene shrinking back down. A misunderstanding, a warning, a humiliating story she would tell later with bitterness in her voice. But if she took out that envelope, whatever happened next would belong to something bigger than a bad stop at a gas station. She picked it up anyway. When she turned back, Officer Holloway's attention locked onto it instantly. "What is that?" he asked. His tone was different now, still controlled but sharpened at the edges. Alora walked back toward him, stopping just outside his reach. "Something my husband told me to keep in the car." "For what?" She held his gaze. "For this." A murmur rippled somewhere behind them, not words, just that faint shift a crowd makes when the story changes direction and everyone senses it. The officer extended his hand. "Give it to me." She did not move for a beat, then she placed it in his palm. He looked down at the envelope, then back at her. "What's inside?" "I was told not to open it," she said. "And I'm supposed to?" "Yes." He did not seem to like that answer. His jaw tightened slightly, and for the first time since he had approached her, he looked less certain of the shape of the scene. He slid a finger under the seal and opened it carefully. Whatever he expected to find, it was not enough to make him stop. He unfolded the first page and began reading. Alora watched his face. At first, there was almost nothing. Professional stillness, a man committed to revealing as little as possible in front of an audience. Then his eyes moved to the second paragraph. A tiny shift. His mouth tightened. He read more slowly. By the time he reached the second page, the confident performance he had walked up with was gone. He was no longer reading like a man verifying a suspicion. He was reading like a man discovering that he had stepped into someone else's design. He looked up at her. "Where did you get this?" The question came out lower than before. "My husband left it for me." His expression hardened, but not in the way it had earlier. This was different. Earlier, he had looked like a man building a case. Now he looked like a man recalculating risk. "What exactly did he tell you?" he asked. Alora shook her head. "Just to keep it with me, and to hand it over if an officer questioned the authorization." That answer landed. She saw it land. The officer glanced down at the page again. Whatever was written there had done exactly what Elias promised. It had made him slow down. Cars still idled behind her.
Someone coughed near the air pump. A child asked a question from the backseat of a truck and was shushed immediately. The whole station seemed to have shifted from curiosity to something more fragile and serious. The atmosphere people feel when they realize the person in authority may not be the safest person in the scene. Officer Holloway folded the papers halfway, then stopped and opened them again as if he needed to confirm something. He looked toward her car, then toward the line of vehicles, then beyond them, somewhere far enough away that she could not tell what he was seeing. When he finally spoke, his voice was stripped of its earlier edge. "Stay here." Alora's pulse jumped. Why? He ignored the question. Instead, he reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder. He turned just enough that he was no longer directly facing her, but not enough to stop her hearing the first words that came through his teeth. "I need command out here," he said quietly. "Now." He listened for a response, eyes fixed on the papers in his hand. Then he added something that made the cold spread through Alora's chest. "No, this isn't about the card anymore." And in that moment, she understood, with a clarity that almost hurt, that the envelope had never been meant to protect her from embarrassment. It had been meant to expose whoever tried. The officer didn't lower the radio right away. He kept it close to his mouth, listening, his eyes still fixed on the papers in his hand, as if whatever was written there had not finished speaking to him yet. The confidence he had walked up with had not disappeared completely, but it had shifted into something tighter, more controlled, like he was now aware that every word he chose could matter in ways he had not anticipated 5 minutes earlier. Alora stood where he had told her to stay. She did not step forward, she did not step back. She didn't look at the people around her, even though she could feel their attention pressing in from all sides. Instead, she watched him, the same way she had watched Elias at the kitchen table when she realized something important was being said without being explained. There are moments when a situation changes shape, not because anyone announces it, but because the balance of certainty moves from one person to another. This was one of those moments. "What do you mean it's not about the card?" a voice crackled faintly through the officer's radio. He turned slightly away, lowering his voice just enough to suggest he wanted privacy, but not enough to achieve it. "I'll explain when you get here," he said. "Just get here." There was a pause on the other end. Then, "Is there a problem with the subject?" Subject. Alora felt that word land somewhere deep and cold in her chest. She had gone from driver to subject in the space of a few minutes, and the man who had made that transition sound so easy was now standing a few feet away from her reading something that had unsettled him. "There may be," he replied. "May be." That was new. He lowered the radio and exhaled slowly, folding the papers more carefully this time, as though the act of folding them required more attention than it should have. When he looked back at her, his expression had changed again. It wasn't softer, but it wasn't dismissive anymore either. "How long have you had this?" he asked. Alora held his gaze. "Since my husband deployed." "And he told you to carry it with you?" "Yes." "In your car?" "Yes." Another pause. "And only use it if someone questioned the authorization?" "That's what he said." The officer nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something to himself rather than to her. "Did he say anything else?" Alora thought about it. She thought about the way Elias had looked that night, the way he had chosen his words carefully, not because he didn't trust her, but because he didn't trust the situation she might one day find herself in. "He said it would make people slow down," she answered. The officer's mouth tightened. "That's one way of putting it." He looked past her again, toward the line of cars, toward the people who were still pretending not to watch. Then his eyes returned to her, sharper now. "Did he tell you why?" "No." "Did you ask?" "Yes." "And?" "He said it was the only answer he was giving me." The officer gave a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "That sounds about right." That caught her off guard. What does that mean? For a second, it looked like he might answer. Then he stopped himself, glancing down at the papers again, as if reminding himself that whatever he was thinking did not belong in a public conversation. "You're going to stay right here," he said, more firmly this time, "and you're not going to leave until this is sorted out." Alora felt something rise in her chest again, not fear this time, but something sharper. "I wasn't planning to leave," she said. He studied her for a moment, as if reassessing her completely. That was when she saw it clearly. The way his posture had changed, the way he was no longer standing over her, but slightly angled, cautious in a way that had not been there before. He was still in control of the scene in terms of authority, but not in the way he had expected. Now he was managing it, not driving it. And that difference mattered. A low rumble rolled through the station as another vehicle pulled in, but no one moved to fill the empty space at Pump 4. The silence had settled into something heavier, something that made even ordinary movement feel inappropriate. "How many people have you stopped like this?" Alora asked quietly. The question slipped out before she could decide whether to ask it. The officer's eyes snapped back to hers. "What? How many people have you stopped like this?" she repeated. "Military spouses, using cards tied to deployed service members." For a moment, he didn't answer. Then he said, "That's not relevant." "It feels relevant." "That's not for you to decide." "No," she said, her voice steady, "but it might be for someone else." That landed. She saw it in the way his jaw tightened again, not with irritation this time, but with something closer to recognition. "What exactly do you think is happening here?" he asked. Alora didn't rush the answer. "I think," she said slowly, "that you were very sure of something when you walked up to me." He said nothing. "And I think," she continued, "you're not as sure now." A long pause stretched between them. The kind that forces truth into the space, whether anyone wants it there or not. Before he could respond, the sound of tires cutting over gravel pulled both their attention toward the entrance of the station. A second patrol vehicle. It rolled in slower than the first had arrived, deliberate in its approach, like the person behind the wheel already knew this was not a routine stop. The engine cut off. The driver's door opened. A woman stepped out. Mid-50s, composed, the kind of presence that didn't need to announce authority to carry it. She glanced once at the line of cars, once at the small cluster of people pretending not to watch, and then her eyes settled on Officer Holloway. "What's going on?" she asked. Her voice was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that comes from someone who has seen enough situations to recognize when something is off before it's explained. Holloway straightened slightly. "Ma'am," he said, handing her the folded papers, "you're going to want to see this." She took them without comment, unfolded the first page, and began to read. Alora watched her the same way she had watched him. The first line passed without reaction. The second slowed her. By the third, something shifted in her expression. Not surprise, something more controlled than that. Concern. She turned the page, finished reading, then lowered the papers and looked at Holloway, not at Alora. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "From her," he said. The woman's eyes moved to Alora. "Your name?" "Alora Vance." "And your husband is Commander Elias Vance?" "Yes." Another awkward pause. "Did he tell you to carry this?" she asked. "Yes." "Did he explain why?" "No." The woman nodded once, then looked back at Holloway. "And you approached her based on the card?" "Yes, ma'am." "And what exactly did you believe was happening?" There it was, not a casual question, a precise one. Holloway hesitated just long enough for it to matter. "I believed the card might be misused." "Might be," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." "And what led you to that conclusion?" Another pause. Longer this time, because now the question wasn't about procedure,
It was about judgment. "I've seen cases like this before," he said. The woman's gaze held steady. "Have you?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement with weight behind it. Holloway shifted slightly. "Yes, ma'am." "And how many of those cases involved confirmed misuse?" Silence. The kind that answers the question without words. The woman glanced back down at the papers in her hand, then back at him. "Do you know what this is?" she asked quietly. "Yes, ma'am." "Then say it." He hesitated again, because saying it meant acknowledging something he had not expected to confront. "It's documentation," he said. "That's not what I asked." Another pause, then reluctantly, "It's a formal record." "Of what?" He swallowed. "Of prior complaints." The word hung there. Complaints. Not assumptions, not possibilities. Complaints. The woman nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something she had suspected before she arrived. "And not just complaints," she added, her voice still calm, still controlled. "Documented patterns, names, dates, internal notes." Holloway said nothing. "And a direct instruction," she continued, lifting the top page slightly, "to escalate any future incident involving this officer to command level immediately." The air changed again, because now the story was no longer about a woman at a gas pump. It was about a man who walked into a situation he thought he understood and triggered something that had been waiting for him. Alora felt her pulse in her throat, not from fear but from clarity, because suddenly Elias's warning made complete sense. This was never about protecting her from one moment. It was about exposing a pattern that needed the right moment. And Officer Grant Holloway had just created it. For a few seconds after Captain Renee Callahan arrived, the entire gas station seemed to hold itself in suspension, as though everyone present understood that whatever had begun as a routine public humiliation had just crossed into something far more serious. Nothing about the scene looked dramatic in the way people usually imagine moments of truth. There were no raised voices, no crowd surging forward, no instant unraveling. Instead, what changed was quieter and more unsettling than that. The certainty Officer Grant Holloway had carried into the encounter began to drain from him in plain sight, and the power he had been using so comfortably only minutes earlier stopped feeling secure the moment someone else with real authority began asking questions he could not answer with confidence. That was the first real shift, not the envelope itself, not even the expressions on the faces around them, but the simple fact that his actions were no longer being interpreted through his own version of events. Up until then, he had controlled the frame. He had chosen the tone, the assumptions, the level of pressure, and the public posture of suspicion. He had approached Alora Vance as if the burden of proof belonged entirely to her, as if the absence of her husband made her easier to challenge, easier to embarrass, easier to define in front of strangers who knew nothing about her except what the officer appeared willing to imply. But once the written record in Elias Vance's envelope entered the scene, the frame changed. Suddenly, it was not Alora's legitimacy under scrutiny, it was his. And once that happened, the atmosphere around the station changed in a way no one could miss. The people waiting in line still sat in their vehicles, still watched through windshields and cracked windows, still tried to maintain the polite distance strangers keep when they feel they are witnessing something uncomfortable. But the emotional center of the moment had shifted. Earlier, their silence had carried the uneasy pressure of public suspicion. Now it carried something else entirely. The slow, dawning realization that the wrong person had been treated like a problem, and that the person who had acted most certain might have been relying on that kind of mistake for much longer than anyone wanted to admit. Captain Callahan did not need theatrics to make that clear. She did not need anger either. Her questions, steady and precise, stripped the situation down to what it actually was. Evidence mattered. Specific cause mattered, a prior record mattered, procedure mattered.
And when the layers of posture and assumption were peeled back, what remained was difficult for Officer Holloway to hide behind. There was no confirmed misuse of the fuel authorization card. There was no pre-existing report tied specifically to Alora. There was no concrete violation that justified the tone, the spectacle, or the decision to challenge her publicly the way he had. There was only suspicion sharpened by confidence, and confidence made dangerous by habit. That was the truth moment, and like most meaningful truths, it did not arrive with noise. It arrived with the collapse of pretense. It arrived in the stillness that follows when a person who is used to being believed is forced to stand inside the weakness of his own reasoning. It arrived in the visible narrowing of Officer Holloway's options as the record in the envelope connected the present incident to something larger than himself. This was no longer a question of whether he had misread a card at a gas station during wartime fuel rationing. It was a question of whether he had developed a pattern of targeting military families, particularly spouses of deployed personnel, under the cover of procedure and plausible concern. Once that possibility was no longer abstract, the scene stopped being about one woman at one pump. It became evidence. Alora felt that shift before anyone explained it to her fully. She did not need access to internal notes or command-level language to understand what she was seeing. She had lived the opening minutes of it in her body. She had felt the embarrassment of being singled out, the cold awareness of strangers turning to look, the deliberate way an officer had tried to make her feel small in public while attaching suspicion to her husband's absence. She knew what it felt like to be treated as though her connection to service mattered only when it could be used against her. And now, standing there as the scene turned back on the man who had initiated it, she understood something that had been forming in the background ever since Elias first handed her the envelope. This had never been about protecting her from one bad interaction. It had been about preventing a repeated kind of abuse from remaining invisible.
The investigation that followed did not explode outward in one dramatic burst, because real accountability rarely works that way. Instead, it moved with the weight and seriousness of something that had been waiting too long to be acknowledged. Reports were pulled, names resurfaced, complaints that had once been filed away with little consequence were revisited in a new light now that they were no longer standing alone. What had looked isolated when viewed separately began to look unmistakably connected when seen together. Different dates, different locations, different families, but the same tone, the same assumptions, the same misuse of authority disguised as vigilance. The pattern that Elias had anticipated before he deployed was no longer hidden in scattered fragments. It had a shape now, and once a pattern takes on a shape, it becomes much harder to dismiss. By the end of the day, Officer Holloway was no longer the one defining what had happened at the gas station. Others were documenting it. Others were asking the questions. Others were deciding what came next. That did not erase what Alora had experienced, and it did not magically undo the damage of being publicly challenged in a moment when she had done nothing wrong, but it mattered all the same. Justice is not always loud enough to feel satisfying in the instant it arrives. Sometimes it is simply the point at which a person who expected no consequences realizes he is no longer protected by silence, and the person he tried to corner is no longer standing alone inside his version of the story. When Alora finally returned home that evening, the house did not feel triumphant. It felt quiet in the way homes do after emotionally exhausting days, when even familiar objects seem to carry a different weight because the person moving among them has changed. The envelope rested on the kitchen counter, no longer mysterious, no longer threatening, but still deeply significant. A few days earlier, it had seemed like an object built around secrecy, around unnamed possibilities and warnings that sounded too vague to be comforting. Now it felt almost painfully clear. Elias had seen something before he left.
Maybe not every detail, maybe not the exact shape this day would take, but enough to understand that preparedness is sometimes the only language injustice respects. He had known that authority can become careless in the presence of absence. He had known that some people become emboldened when they believe a family has lost its visible protection. And perhaps most importantly, he had known that truth sometimes needs structure if it is going to survive contact with power. Later that night, when a delayed message from him finally reached her, the exchange between them was brief, but the brevity carried its own kind of intimacy. There was no need for over-explanation because the meaning was already there. He had been right, and both of them knew it. Yet even in that quiet acknowledgement, there was no sense of victory in the shallow sense. What remained instead was something more complicated and more human. Relief that he had prepared her, sorrow that he had needed to, and a deep awareness that many families never get the chance to expose what is happening to them because they are too busy surviving it. And that is where the story settles, not in outrage alone, but in reflection. Because what happened to Elora Vance was never just about fuel rationing, a military card, or one officer making the wrong call. It was about the danger of unchecked assumptions and the kind of authority that begins to confuse itself with truth simply because no one has interrupted it yet. It was about how easily dignity can be threatened when the person holding power believes the other person has no witness, no backing, no one close enough to matter. But more than that, it was about something many people learn too late. The absence of visible protection does not mean a person is unprotected, and silence should never be mistaken for weakness. There is also a harder truth in it, one that lingers long after the scene itself ends. Systems do not fail only in their biggest scandals. Sometimes they fail in smaller, repeatable ways that become normal precisely because they happen to people who are expected to endure them quietly. A pattern does not become less dangerous because it is subtle. In many cases, subtlety is what allows it to survive. And that is why moments like this matter. Not because every story ends perfectly, and not because one investigation erases every wound, but because there are times when one person refusing to collapse under someone else's assumptions becomes the first crack in a much older wall. In the end, the deepest kind of justice is not always revenge, and it is not always spectacle. Sometimes it is exposure. Sometimes it is interruption. Sometimes it is the undeniable proof that a person who thought he could act without scrutiny was wrong. And sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do in a humiliating moment is remain steady long enough for the truth to reveal who was really being tested. So here is the question this story leaves behind. When someone in authority humiliates a person in public and calls it procedure, how often do we stop to ask whether we are watching enforcement or simply watching power choose an easy target? If this story stayed with you, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy emotionally driven storytelling that pulls back the surface of moments like these, take a second to like the video and subscribe, because the next story begins with something that looks almost too small to matter, and that is exactly why nobody saw the damage coming until it was already far too late.